We're doing the third part of the shul. It's the last part of the shul. It should go very quickly. There are not that many items, but they're important. Many of them can occur on every Shabbat, every week. We're dealing now with those issues that are prohibited midrabanan, that were prohibited by the rabbis because they resemble bishul, or they may cause one to come and do bishul, cooking on Shabbat, and that is why they were prohibited. As you know, the rabbis many times prohibited something just to put up a fence, to do us a favor, so we do not forget or get confused and do the wrong thing, which is something which is prohibited according to the Torah. According to the Torah, it's prohibited to cook on Shabbat or to light a flame. So the rabbis prohibited taking a bath on Shabbat if it's the entire body, regular bath or shower, in hot water, even though the water was cooked, was warmed up before Shabbat. So even though the water is already prepared from before Shabbat, whether it's in an urn, whether it's in some other form or fashion, and you're not doing any bishul on Shabbat, what would be wrong in pouring the hot water over your body? Nothing, according to the Torah. But the rabbis decreed that this may lead one to transgress the prohibition of cooking or turning on a flame on Shabbat. So the chita, kol gufo bechamin, is asur on Shabbat. Bathing one's entire body in warm water is asur on Shabbat. What is not asur is parts of the body, the hands, the feet, the face, right? These are parts. You have water that was warmed before Shabbat, of course. You can use it to rinse your face or your hands and so forth. That would not be a problem. The problem is the entire body. So the question arises, what happens if somebody needs to go to a tevilah? This applies to men and women, but especially women which have a mitzvah to immerse themselves in a tevilah after, the completion of the days of impurity, of nidah. There's a mitzvah of going to the mikveh on time. You just can't push it off for no good reason. There has to be a very good reason to just push it off. And sometimes the mikveh night is Friday night. So we discussed this when we went over the halachot of tarat ha-mishpacha. So for those of you who are not here, this relates to Shabbat too. Hot water is a problem. Can't take a bath on Shabbat in hot water. But what about tevilah? So the halacha is, since this is a mitzvah for her, we can't expect her to just jump into cold water either. And most of the times the mikveh is at least lukewarm. So it's permissible for the woman to immerse herself in the mikveh, preferably that it should not be very hot. Preferably the mikveh should just be lukewarm, if possible. So the man who regularly goes to the mikveh, regular means on a daily basis, only he would be able to immerse himself in the mikveh, preferably only if it's lukewarm or cold, not hot. Because then it becomes very similar like taking a bath, and you might forget, may not be able to distinguish. So this would be one of the examples, one situation where one would be able to immerse himself in warm water, his entire body, either the woman going to the mikveh on Friday night or the man who regularly goes. Another situation which may be permissible, and that would be a yoledet, a woman who has just given birth. In the first 30 days, she considers like someone who's ill. And anybody who's ill, who needs a bath in warm water for some good reason due to his illness, he's allowed to be bathed in that water, so long as that water, of course, was warmed up before Shabbat. There are situations where we can have a goy, for example, help out in preparing something, but that's only for a child, somebody who's very sick, and the like. But right now we're dealing with water that was warmed up before Shabbat. It's still not permissible for someone to take a bath, but for those individuals, if the rabbis permit so, they can use the warm water. The question arises, okay, all of this is because one may come to the issur of mav'ir, which we haven't covered, mav'ir is turning on a flame, or one may come to transgressing bishul, which is cooking. So what happens with cold water? Not lukewarm, not warm, cold water. Is one allowed to take a cold water shower? In this area, there's difference between Sephardim and Sephardim say no problem whatsoever. They followed the opinion that cold water was never a part of the decree, and it wasn't. Cold water was never a part of the decree, and they say, go ahead. I'm not going to talk about swimming right now. Swimming is a whole different issue, or immersing oneself in a river or a lake and the like. Right now we're just talking about in a tub, a shower, similar situation. A cold shower, if you're Sephardi and you feel that you need a cold shower, there's no issue. You do have to watch from other problems of sehita, not squeezing the towel, not using the sponge, not using the hard soap, for other problems. In shampoo, according to some opinions too, liquid soap would not be a problem, according to most opinions. So there are other issues that you have to watch out for. If you're going to the mikveh, or if the woman needs to go, or if the sick person is involved, or if it's cold, there's other issues that you have to watch out for, but there's no issur. Ashkenazim are mahmir, and they don't take cold showers either on Shabbat with the entire body, unless you're a New Yorker. New Yorkers are exempt. I'm joking. But there's some truth to every joke, right? If it's very humid weather, it's extremely uncomfortable, and you're not in an air-conditioned home, or you are, but you just came and you from the street and you're in a very uncomfortable situation, you can dip yourself and take a quick, cold shower. So that would be an exception. That would be possible. Extreme pain, discomfort, completely dirty, you fell into mud, very humid outside. In those situations, it would be permissible. It's like you're sick. Okay, so that covers pretty much bathing. Anybody have any questions about bathing on Shabbat? That's basically the issues concerning bathing. I just say, there are other issues that could be a problem, like the hitah, like squeezing, the towels and the like, the hair that the woman has to be careful with. No, with squeezing, it sounds like the hitah. There are other issues that can come about that one needs to be careful with. But as far as the bathing, the gezerah, the decree was just on hot water and just the entire group. And there were, by the way, times where people would go into bathhouses. The Jews were in charge. Sometimes they would turn on the hot water and make the hot water on Shabbat. They would say, the water was turned on, was prepared before Shabbat. In other words, it was very easy. Very easily people would come to transgress by, once you allow them one thing, they would say, I did this before Shabbat. In fact, it was done on Shabbat. So the Chachamim said, you know what? Let's not allow it altogether if we're dealing with the entire body, except for the few individuals that are permitted to immerse themselves. Yes. If she needs to, during the first 30 days, right? She's like a sick person. They need, of course, only water that was warmed up before Shabbat. Unless it was very urgent for some other situation. But otherwise, we're dealing with only warm water that was warmed before Shabbat. If it's natural springs, the Chachamim did not include that. Right, naturally. That was also not part of the original. Anytime you're dealing with solar energy, there are some leniencies, right? Because it's solar, not electrical and not with fire. There are some leniencies. But today, for the most part, we do not distinguish between water that was warmed through solar energy or through other methods. There are some situations that you may be able to use warm water that was warmed through solar energy. We're going to talk about that soon when we talk about washing. No, cold shower, you can bathe the entire body. When we talk about warm shower, warm bath, the decree was for the entire body. Part of the body is fine. You can use warm water that was warmed before Shabbat to cleanse your hands, your face, not the entire body. The cold shower, you can take a cold shower for the entire body if you're a Sephardi. If you're Ashkenaz, no. The custom is not allow any showers on Shabbat, even cold showers. Unless a situation arises where there is a need, that the rabbi said that is an exception. Shalom Bait? No. Let us be patient a little bit. Not wait till after Shabbat. What are we dealing with here? 12 hours? It's Friday after evening you took one. So the question only arises in the morning. In the morning you're in shul anyway. So when is it going to be? In the afternoon? Right, so depending on the situation. Something is exceptional. Yeah, that would be okay. Alright, the next issue was Shimush Baberet, how to use a faucet on Shabbat. Sounds funny. What's wrong with using a faucet? The problem is that there's a hot faucet, there's a cold water faucet. And there's a prohibition of turning or using the hot water faucet on Shabbat. Because what is happening? The way most systems work is we're allowing cold water to enter the boiler, and that will heat up after you've used up, even though the tank contains water that has been heated up from before. That may be so. But eventually, at some point, more cold water is entering the boiler, and that's being heated up. And you're causing that by opening the hot water faucet. So even though there's different types of boilers, they all work similar, in that eventually, at some point, the cold water is being boiled. It's being boiled, depending on how high you set up your thermostat, to Yat Soledet point, usually, where it's hot enough to be called Bishul. We're cooking the water, then we cannot use the hot water faucet on Shabbat. There are those who have come up with all sorts of creative ideas on how to use the hot water from the faucet. And that is by turning or by closing off the cold water. If you somehow close off the cold water completely, no cold water will enter the hot water, and all you're using is this hot water that was warmed up before Shabbat, then theoretically it should be okay. Follow me? So in case you live in freezing temperature, you need to somehow wash dishes. I'll tell you how other people wash dishes, but in those situations, but there are creative ways that one may be able to. So it's not altogether, just that most situations don't allow for that. So you have to be careful. Sometimes people do not realize with faucets that when you don't have separate faucets, you have one. If you just turn the sides, you have to be careful, which side you turn it to. Even though you do it for a second, nothing will happen. It's only when you leave it long enough that the cold water starts up. There are others who think that by closing or by shutting down the heat, and just leaving it on pilot, the position of pilot, that would be sufficient. No, it's not sufficient, because remember, the hot water that's in the tank right now is very hot. So if you let the cold water in, even if you shut down the thermostat, and let the pilot, it's still hot. So it's still mixing and can become very, very hot too. So that would not solve the situation. There are different boilers. that may work differently, but for the most part it's just best to avoid this because usually it's difficult to work around it. What about electric boiler? Right, there's no flame, but you're still boiling or cooking the water, right? The cold water that is entering. That's the issue over here. The issue is cooking new water that is coming in the tank. That would be the issue. So the conventional way of using hot water from the faucet is usually a problem on Shabbat. So how does one wash dishes on Shabbat? No problem. If you have an urn, you have a percolator that has hot water that you can put coffee and so forth, you can pour that into a bowl. In the winter, in some cities, in some countries, it becomes very, very difficult to wash dishes, where the water is very cold. Now, if you have a maid, eventually we'll be talking about how to deal with a maid in one's home, what she may and what she may not do for you. There may be a food on Shabbat, depending on if it's Midorai Talmud or Rabbanan. So there are differences between if she does it or if we do it. However, if we're washing the dishes, we can use the water from the urn, from the percolator. That would be one way to warm up the water, so it shouldn't be so cold. However, one has to be careful when he's washing the dishes that the hot boiling water that he's pouring should not fall onto something that may not have cooked. Leftover food, things that we may be cooking them now when we're pouring the hot water on top of them. Sometimes that could be a problem. Another, by the way, point that people forget when they're washing dishes is that one is not allowed to wash dishes for Motzei Shabbat. When we're washing dishes, it's because we need them right away or very soon for the next meal. Then that's okay. But there's a rule you cannot prepare on Shabbat or after Shabbat. So if you're washing dishes, let's say you can have a nice clean kitchen, that's not permissible. It would have to be because you need the glass, you need a plate for the coming meal. Yeah. We're going to talk about that. So, down here, we're going to talk about mixing of waters, cold and hot, where there is and where there is no problem. But right now, in principle, that would be the way of washing dishes in warm water from the urn, right? There's no problem with it, except if perhaps there's some dirt there, some leftover food that we're concerned with bishul. When you pour, irui, called pouring, has a little bit of the strength of cooking. So you have to be careful where you're pouring the hot water, onto what are you pouring that hot water. Hopefully there's not that much dirt or leftover food on the plate. No, because you're washing the dishes because you want to put it away, because you don't need them anymore. That's not, you have to leave them until Motzei Shabbat. Now glass cups, if you may use them in the afternoon, there are guests that come, you can always wash them out because you always use glass or cups, even in the afternoon, or later in the afternoon people may come over, you want to have always glass. But the plates and the hamim, leftover from the meal that you just had, what are you going to wash them for? There's no more meals. No, that's not it. You can put them in the sink, have water there, smell, but you cannot wash them thoroughly. Okay, the next point we discussed a little bit last week, and that is how to properly use a plata or a blech, that cover that we put on the fire, that has various advantages. Anybody who was not here last week, you can ask me later. There are quite a few advantages of covering the fire on Shabbat. However, when we cover the fire, usually we're covering one flame. Most people don't have more than one flame on. It's possible to have more than one flame, but assuming you have one of the flames, one of the burners on, in the plata or the blech or the cover covers two burners, what you have here is various areas within this sheet metal that are warm at different degrees of heat. The portion that is directly above the flame is the hottest. And if you were to put a bowl of soup, a pot of soup, on top of that spot, it eventually will boil and cook, regardless of the sheet metal separating the pot and the fire. It may take longer, but eventually it will cook. If you move away from the flame, because it's metal conducts heat very well. So you have another area of that metal that is warm or very warm, but it's away from the fire. These various areas make a difference on Shabbat for the following reason. One must be very careful not to stir the food if the pot is on top of the fire, even if it's fully cooked. We are very mahmir in this, not stir the food when it's directly over the flame. The stirring is memaheret habishul. It can contribute to the cooking by accelerating the cooking, and that could be a problem. That's a source if it's directly on the flame. So even though the flame is covered, if you want to remove something from you want to remove the contents of the pot, it is because removing is similar to stirring, even though it's not the same, but it's similar. It's always best to move over the pot a little bit over, not to be directly on the flame, if you can, because like this you're avoiding the problem of stirring. So even though you may take out, once the food is fully cooked, remember, fully cooked food, what are you doing? It's already fully cooked. Nevertheless, we don't stir. Maybe part of it is not fully cooked. It appears like cooking. But to take out, if that's the only way you can take out the food, if you leave it there where it is, it's okay. But if you have a choice and you can move it away a little bit, to the second area, the area where it's very hot, but it's not over the flame, that would be the right thing. Now guess what? Once you've moved it aside to that spot where it's still hot, but it's not over the flame, you can always move it back. So that's the advantage of having a big blech. You can always move it back. It's boiling. You left the flame too high before Shabbat. You can't lower it. You can't ask the goy to lower it either. What are you going to do now? If you leave it where it is, there's very little water going to be left by the time you come home from shul. The soup is going to dehydrate. Evaporate. What's dehydrate? I didn't know you know English so well. Anyway, evaporate. Right. Evaporate is the correct word. So how do you avoid that? You move it over a little bit. And then you say you want it really boiling so you can serve it boiling. You can move it back to where it was. As long as where you moved it to is hot. That's the limit for. If your blech is very, very big, and at the very, very end it doesn't get warm, it just gets a bit warm but not hot, you just put your hand there, then if you moved it there, you won't be able to put it back. That's the third area of the blech. Well, there might be, depending on how big that blech is, if there is a third area where it's just a little warm, not very hot, if you move it there, you won't be able to put it back. So that's just like taking, especially for Ashkenazim, actually. For Sephardim, depending, as long as if it's liquid and it hasn't cooled down, you can always put it back. For Temanim, even if it's cooled down, they say en bishul achar bishul afilu v'dalach. There's no cooking again once something has been cooked, whether it's dry food or liquid food. Once it's been cooked, even if it's cold, they can take it out of the fridge and warm it up again, no problem. They follow the Rambam, who follows that opinion. For Sephardim, we're very strict about the liquids that have cooled off. Once they're not hot, they're cooled off, you cannot recook them, you cannot rewarm them. So if they're in a spot where they're going to cool off, you won't be able to put it back. But if it's solid food like potatoes, rice, burekas, and the like, the Sephardim are more lenient that you could put it back directly over the flame as long as the flame is covered. What some rabbis amongst Ashkenazim suggest, if you really want to warm up dry food and you don't have a pot, you can put it on top, that would be the best solution. You just put it on top of another pot, because that doesn't appear like you're cooking. Nobody cooked that food in the middle of the week. But if you don't have that solution, you can put that dry food at the edge of the blech where it's going to be warm, as long as it's not directly over the flame. Nobody has a problem with putting any food at the very edge where it's not very hot, because that's for sure won't cook it. The question is, the second area of the blech where it becomes very hot, but it's not directly over the flame. Some say it's permissible. For Sephardim, if the fire is covered, you shouldn't have a problem as long as the food is completely cooked, the fire is covered. So that would be one area. Those would be the two issues concerning the various areas of the plata. I call it plata because some of these issues apply to a hot warmer. Some say a warmer is easier to use than a cover on the fire, because a warmer is only intended to warm or preserve the heat, not to cook. If that's the case, as they have some warmers in Israel that are called plata le Shabbat, that all it does is keep it warm, and you cannot raise the temperature. Many opinions would agree that you could use it on Shabbat to take out dry food and just put it on top. Alright, what do you do if the fire is extinguished? This could happen. This has happened. Now, if it's Friday night, you may want to eat right away. But what if this is the food that you need for Shabbat morning? The flame extinguished. So what do? You can't ask the goy to turn it on. We'll learn that when we talk about what you can tell a goy. You cannot ask the goy to turn on the fire on Shabbat. What do? It can be a problem. However, if you have a good neighbor, right, that has a blech, that has a fire that's covered, and there's no problem with carrying this one house to the next house, because once you have a carrying problem, that's another problem, you would be able to take it to his house and put it on his blech as long as your pot is still boiling hot. See? Neighbors have some usefulness, as long as they're good neighbors. Or if you had another flame, you could put it on the other flame, of course, as long as that flame is covered. You can always put it on top of another pot, but that might not be hot enough. So there are a few solutions of what to do if the flame is extinguished. One of them is not calling the goy. You cannot call a goy, and in all circumstances. But there may be a way to put it somewhere else. What do you do with the gas? The gas is running. Can you shut the valve? There's no use. There's no flame. The gas is running. The rabbis permit shutting the valve, but one should do it with his shinui, his left hand, with his elbow, so it should not appear as though he's doing something that he does during the week. Alright, transferring. We said that there's no problem between transferring hot boiling food that was fully cooked from one part of the flame to another flame, as long as the flame is covered. The same is true if you have food in your oven that is boiling, it's hot, it's fully cooked. Now you want to put it on top of the stove. As long as you did not put it down somewhere and forget about it, right, you can transfer from the oven to the stove. You cannot do it the other way around. If the oven is on, you can never take food that's on the stove and put it into the oven. Once, as I explained last week, once you've taken food out of the oven that's on Shabbat, you can never put it back inside, unless you have some insert. So there's very little advantage of using an oven on Shabbat. There are two problems I explained last week. Problem number one is you have to know when to open the door, so that you don't cause the thermostat to turn on the heat by letting cold air in. So that you can usually tell when it's working either by hearing, by listening, looking at the lights outside. You open the door then. But then, even if you did so, you cannot put back the food inside the oven. It appears as though you're cooking. Why? Right. So even if the food was fully cooked already, there's no chazara into a tanur on Shabbat. Whether it was in the fridge or whether it was on Shabbat, it was already inside. You cannot put it back inside. Yes? Right? What about... Right? I don't understand. What did they do exactly? Right? I would have to see how it was built. It all depends. In the ovens that we have today, because that is the way we cook and bake in them, by just inserting, the tray or whatever inside, it appears as you're cooking or baking. If you were to have an insert inside, some heker, or if you were to do it in a fashion that is different than during the week, it would be permissible to have. It would have to be different than the way you do it during the week, so it shouldn't appear as though you're cooking. That is the purpose. That is the reason why one of the reasons why we have the cover on the fire. Because in case you've taken off something to serve, you haven't put it down, you're able to put it back, right? As long as it's still hot. Now comes one of the most important issues on Shabbat that may happen to any one of you. And in this area, there's a little bit of a difference between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. That is, what do you do if you wake up in the morning and your cholent is drying up? Can you add water? Chas v'shalom, you can't add cold water from the faucet because you can't cook the water. The question is, can you add boiling water? You have a percolator, you have an urn, right? Or you have a kumkum on, a tea kettle sitting on the fire. Can you just pour? This is very important because this happens. You didn't measure the correct amount of water before Shabbat, or something else happened. It's just drying up. So this is important. The answer is, if you're an Ashkenaz, then you have it easier than if you're a Sephardi. For Ashkenazim, it's no problem. If you have an urn, boiling water, and it's close to the pot, the cord reaches that you can bring over the urn. Just open the faucet on top of this pot. It's a crock pot, for example. They're both sitting on the counter, right? The two are on the same counter. By the way, whenever because you may have this situation, make sure you have something close by. The cord reaches of one of the two, the pot or the urn. You bring them close to each other. You pick up the urn, and you open the faucet directly into the pot. And the hot water, boiling water, comes down into the pot, and you fill it up a little bit. Don't put too much water, otherwise you'll have a soupy cholent. You may not want that either. So just add whatever you need. Some say it's better to take out the insert of the crock pot, bring it, not put it down, bring it underneath the urn, open the water, and then put it back inside. There's various reasons why this may be better, according to some opinions. But you don't have to do that if it's too heavy or too difficult. You can just bring the urn and open the faucet inside. Some even allow, let's say just too far, put a cup underneath the urn, pour yourself some boiling water, and add. That you should not do unless there's no other choice whatsoever in the world. You should not do it. Because the cup is called now a kli sheni. It loses some of the heat. Now, that is the area where Sephardim have a problem. According to the Sephardic opinion, anytime the water comes down, you're pouring it, or you're pouring it into a cup, it loses heat. Remember, and they are very concerned with liquids that have lost their heat, that they shouldn't be recooked. So once you're pouring, the temperature in the water that's being poured is not as high as the temperature of the water that's in the crock pot. So many Sephardic rabbis not allow this method that I just told you to add water. Some say it's perfectly fine, because if the urn is boiling water, then what should be the problem here? It's not a kli sheni. It's not that it has cooled off. It's still boiling hot. Some say that it shouldn't be a problem. Some suggest, in order to avoid this conflict, this argument, this issue, is to use a matzeket. Matzeket is a ladle. If you put the ladle inside the urn that contains the hot water, and you keep it there for a few seconds, the ladle becomes a kli rishon, according to some opinions, right? It becomes just like the urn because it's inserted inside. You take that hot water in the ladle and immediately put it into the crock pot or into the pot, but you do not pour it. You just put it in. And then you don't have ilui, you have almost the same temperature between the two pots. So this is a good suggestion too. You can do that without a problem. Yes. No, you should not stir something that's directly on the fire. Anything that's directly on the fire should not be stirred, right? No. Stirring is stirring, where you're moving things from the bottom to the top and the top to the bottom, right, mixing it. Here you're just putting it directly inside. It's not a problem. Yeah. No? It's not muktzeh. You use that on Shabbat, right? Why? Because you might disconnect it? You have to be careful you don't disconnect the plugs. That, yes, be very careful with that. No. You can move it around, you could use it. It's something that's permissible for Shabbat. It's just connected to a source of electricity, just like the pot is close to a flame. So, there are quite a few opinions that would agree that you can pour directly, and that's what I do. Pour directly from the urn into the crock pot. Or take the crock pot, take it, the insert out, bring it close to the urn. Don't put it down, and have the water pour directly inside. That's fine too. Sephardim are a little bit stricter in this case, so you could either use the suggestion that I told you with the matzeket, or you can follow the opinion that some allow for pouring directly if it's boiling hot. But it would have to be boiling hot. So if you are a Sephardic, there are many who do not allow it, and there are some that say if it's boiling hot, it should be permissible, because the two are very close in temperature. Yes. Why? I gave you the suggestion with the matzeket, if you wait a few seconds and then you put it in directly without pouring it. If you're pouring it, then it's almost just like pouring the other one. What you should not do, whatever you do, especially if you're Sephardi, don't use a cup. Because a cup is for sure a problem for Sephardi. For Ashkenazim, it's not such a problem either. But for Sephardi, the Sephardic opinion, a cup, because it really loses its temperature, the heat, it's for sure a problem. The big question for Sephardim is what's the status of the urn? We know that the urn is much hotter than a cup, because it comes down. It's hotter than if it comes down into a cup. Once it lands in a cup, it's a kli sheni. So some say that it should be okay, because the temperature is almost the same. So you should follow whatever your custom is, that is. Alright, the next issue is mixing of liquids. Cold into hot, hot into cold. When one is very hot and the other is cold, it could be a problem if you mix them. It all depends what keli we're talking about and the quantity. If the keli that we're talking about is a kli sheni, let's say tea in a glass, that's a kli sheni, usually. And it's cold. The tea, you were having some friends over and you were talking for half an hour and the tea cooled off. Can you add hot water? Right, so we're adding hot water into cold water. Is that okay? What do you say? Well, it all depends. In this case, the hot is going into the cold. Will the hot water warm up the cold water? Not if there's more cold than hot. If you have a half a glass of cold tea and you're adding a little bit of more hot water so you should warm up a little bit, nothing's going to happen. Even though irui is able to cook, keklipa, irui, the pouring of hot water does have the ability of cooking, that does not apply to liquids. It only applies to solids. So if you have a lot of cold water and you're only adding a little bit of hot water, you usually should not have a problem. Okay? So actually, that doesn't make a difference if it's a kli sheni or not. We're talking about where the bottom was cold. Now, what if the bottom is hot and you want to add cold water? Okay, so that already depends on if it's a kli sheni or not. If it's a kli sheni, as with a hot glass of tea, where would you want to add cold water? Anybody know? Either because you want it a little cooler, or because you want to add essence. And we'll talk about that next. How do you make tea on Shabbat? The essence of the tea is cold. How could I add essence to hot water? Only because the hot water is in a kli sheni. And a kli sheni does not cook unless it's kalei bishul, those items that cook very easily. So even though I have a lot of hot water, because it's in a kli sheni, I can add a little bit of cold water. Had that hot water been in a kli rishon, in the first keli that was, of course, removed from the fire, and it's boiling hot, I would not be able to add a little bit of cold water. Because the majority of the hot at the bottom would boil or cook the little cold that I'm adding in. But once that hot water is in a kli sheni, like in a glass of tea, no problem. You can add an ice cube, you can add essence, it's in a kli sheni, there would be no problem. Real quickly, no problem with warming bottles of babies. The milk that's inside the bottle, even though it's cold, you took it out of the fridge, there's no problem. You can do it in any way you want. You can pour hot boiling water on top of it. You can put it into boiling water. Why? First of all, the milk was already cooked once upon a time. It was pasteurized. That's number one. Number two, by the time that the water is poured into something else, it becomes a kli sheni. But even if you pour the hot water directly on top of the bottle, nothing happens. Why? Because the bottle separates, the plastic of the bottle is separating the milk from the hot water. So you can never really cook it. It will never be called cooking. It can become very, very hot, but you cannot cook it. So that's never a problem. Don't put it directly over the fire, of course. Okay, what's the best way to make tea or coffee? Alright, with tea, we basically have the following types. You have tea bags, you have tea leaves, and you have nest tea. Okay?
Tea bags is a problem, and so are tea leaves, because they were never cooked, or not cooked enough. Therefore, you would have a problem if you were to put them in a glass, the tea bag, and pour hot boiling water. That would cook it. But you may even have a problem if you pour the hot boiling water first, and you're saying to yourself, well, this is a kli sheni now. Still, remember what we said about kli sheni, even though kli sheni does not cook, it may cook kalei habishul, those items that cook easily. And anything that was not cooked anyway, you do not immerse into a kli sheni for the first time on Shabbat, because it looks like you're cooking it. So therefore, if you want to use a tea bag on Shabbat, you want to use it, that's the only tea you like, that's the only tea you have, the best solution for it is in a kli shlishi. Therefore, you pour the hot water, you open it up into a glass, you take that glass which has become a kli sheni, and you pour it into a second glass. That second glass becomes a kli shlishi. In a kli shlishi, most rabbis hold you can put a tea bag. Yes, that's nes tea. Well, are you talking about the essence, preparing essence before Shabbat? All right. No problem. Because we talked about that 2 weeks ago, that there's no bishul b'chama, the sun, to heat up your food. No problem. Okay? So it's best to first pour the water and then put the tea bag. Right. It's always best to do it that way. Okay? So that's the problem, and that's the way to do it with tea bags or with tea leaves. Some, especially in Israel, what they do is prepare the essence before Shabbat by putting a lot of tea bags, boiling the tea before. Then what you have is cold essence, which you said before is not a problem. You can add the cold essence to a kli sheni. To a kli sheni, you could add that. That would be perfectly fine. What you should not do is pour the essence first, and then pour on top of it hot boiling water. Unless that essence was once cooked, it could be a problem. So you're always better off first pouring the hot boiling water and then adding the essence. The third option is nes tea, the powder tea, which is usually roasted or cooked very well by the manufacturer. That you would theoretically be able to even add first to the cup and then pour hot boiling water. There's no problem. Some say even with that you should be careful and add the water first and then add the tea. But with powder tea, nes tea, that was already processed, cooked by the manufacturer, there's never a problem. Now if you add a slice of lemon, you want to be careful not to pour hot boiling water on that, because that's the initial cooking too. But with the nes tea, there shouldn't be a problem. Same thing with nes cafe. Any coffee that's been cooked, roasted thoroughly well, that's cooked. En bishul achar bishul, you can make nes coffee. What you cannot use on Shabbat is Turkish coffee, because that has not been cooked as well, and because of that, you would not be able to use it. Unless it's a kli shlishi, then perhaps it will be permissible. So choose your way of making coffee or tea, and just remember the rules of kli sheni if you're using a tea bag or tea. With nana, you have to be careful for another reason. Anybody remember? Bugs. Okay? So be careful. You don't want to have bugs in it. Okay, the next issue is tipot mayim. This happens occasionally when you have a glass that's washed. You washed it, you rinsed it, and it's still wet. You want to be careful not to pour hot boiling water on a glass that has drops, because those drops are being cooked. It sounds funny, cooking drops of water, but most rabbis are of the opinion that one has to at least be very careful as much as possible. Dry the glass before the glass is, especially if those drops of water were never cooked in the first place. They're not leftovers from before, from rinsing. So if you can avoid it, you need to avoid it by drying up the glass. Alright, anybody ever go on a trip and take with him soup that's, I forget what it's called, like an instant soup? All you have to do is add boiling water to make the soup. That's not a problem on Shabbat, because that soup usually has been cooked before by the manufacturer. So it's possible to add the boiling water. Some say that because it's not completely cooked perhaps, you should add the hot boiling water first and then add the soup. Or put the hot boiling water into a kli sheni to avoid any issues over here that may have to do with an incomplete bishul. But at least in theory, as long as we know that this was cooked by the manufacturer, you don't have to be concerned. You can't add hot water directly from the urn onto this soup that's concentrated in whatever form it comes. There's various types. Alright, a quick halakha about iruv betim, which most people are unaware of because it's hidden. There's a custom not to mix eggs on Shabbat because the mixing of eggs, batter of eggs, appears as though you're going to be frying or cooking them. So there is such a custom. I don't think most people are going to do it anyway in Shabbat, but I included it in. And the last point that's important is ahzarat ochel asir. You have leftovers. This happens all the time. Kids have leftovers. They didn't finish the food. What do you do with the leftovers? Can you put them back in the pot? Well, it depends where the pot is. If the pot has been removed from the fire, it's sitting on the counter somewhere, and you just want to put it back into that pot, even though that pot may have still contents that are boiling hot, it's okay. That pot is no longer on the fire. Even if it's boiling hot, the contents that you're putting back in have been already fully cooked. Nothing will happen. It's perfectly fine. That pot you can no longer put on top of the fire. Because once you've added food back into the pot, even though you may be able to put the pot that you took off from the flame back on the fire, but once you've added the leftover food into that pot can no longer be put on top of the flame, even if it's solid. What? Well, if you're Sephardic, obviously, there's less of a problem here. Sure, because it's just like taking anything out of the refrigerator. But generally speaking, it's best to avoid that, because there's some that disagree with that opinion that holds that you may put something back directly on the flame. It's only one opinion, unless it's a plata, where there's additional opinions that hold that it's okay. But you have to be careful not to put anything back directly on the flame, especially if it's liquids. If it's solid, then there are some opinions that allow it, as long as the fire is covered and as long as the food has been thoroughly cooked. But to put back the food into its original pot, if that pot is removed from the fire, is not a problem, even though the contents are still very hot. Okay, that covers it for bishul. We may not have covered every single possible situation, but we've pretty much covered the more common things that happen on Shabbat and how one can go about them. There's some areas there are differences between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. Some of those areas Sephardim are lenient, Ashkenazim are strict, and others Ashkenazim are lenient, Sephardim are strict. These are important halachot that need to be constantly reviewed because there are many details, and we have a rule on Hot Shabbat: if you do not review, you for sure forget. And Chaz v'Shalom, if you forget, you may come to something which is asur midoraita. So these are halachot that one has to review and be aware. When a situation arises and he does not know what to do, you need to ask a she'elah. Even though these things that we covered today are midrabanan, nevertheless, even midrabanan is very serious. You don't want to do something unnecessarily. But obviously there's a difference between something which is asur midrabanan and something which is asur midoraita. As we will see later on when we talk about the category of Amira le'akum, what you may or may not tell a goy to do to make a difference. It's something asur midoraita or midrabanan. Okay? Next week is Erev Tisha B'Av shiur. The following week will be the new melacha. This powder? Which powder? The instant soup? Yeah, if it's fully cooked, it's not a problem. Those kubiyot that you can buy and make yourself? Yeah, that's fine. If it's fully cooked, you can add hot boiling water to it. Same thing. As long as they were fully cooked, it's not a problem. There are areas that you have to be concerned with other than bishul that we've already covered in the past. If you're preparing a cereal for your child, for your baby, right? If it's fully cooked, but you're adding liquid, hot water. Remember the issue of lisha? You want to be careful with kneading. If you're not allowed to knead the combination of a liquid and a solid, if it becomes a very thick and dense paste, usually a paste that you cannot easily pour. It's called it's called a blila ava. That could be a problem. That could be a nesud d'oraita too. So you may say, okay, I'm allowed to cook this. I'm allowed to add the hot boiling water. It's not really cooking. It's already cooked. Yeah, but you have to be careful on how to mix it. So there are ways to mix it. And if it's something which you are allowed to mix, it would have to be done with a shinui perhaps, in a different way, so it should not be called lisha. This could be very common with cereals, baby cereals. When you mix it becomes very dense. It becomes like a paste. So even though you may be able to do it because it's not called cooking, because it's been already cooked before, but there might be other issues involved. So you have to keep that in mind too. How to do it so you shouldn't be transgressing lisha. Yeah. No, you can't remove the bugs on Shabbat. It's the problem. I mean, we talked about borer, we talked about the problem of killing bugs beneath the water. You are allowed to cut away the good part away from the bad part, right? That's not called borer. If you take the good from the bad, that's fine. Put them outside. You can't kill the bug, right? Right. None of these that haven't been very well thoroughly cleansed before Shabbat. How are you going to use it on Shabbat? Right. If she's about imminently giving birth, right? Yes, you are. Sure. So whatever you need in order to bring her there. Sure. Anything else? What? We'll talk about that another time. What's the issue with swimming? Yeah. There's a lot of halachot in Shabbat that eventually we'll cover that do not fall under any particular melacha, but it may involve several melachot. For example, how to take a plane or how to get on a boat, when to do so before Shabbat. There are many, many issues, that you're not immediately doing a melacha, but it may lead to a melacha. So you have to be aware of it. People that went right now on El Al, that arrived on Shabbat, they had a problem. They would not be able to leave the airport. It would have to be Shabbat at the airport. So there are quite a few halachot that one needs to be aware of. So Mizat Hashem will cover towards the end. Right. Yeah? You sure? Understood? Yeah. Just make sure that you don't vomit too much, because Shabbat is made to enjoy. Right? So if you're getting seasick and you're not enjoying Shabbat, you shouldn't be on the cruise. Yeah, I'm serious. That's one of the reasons why, you're not allowed to get on a cruise too close to Shabbat. You're not allowed to get on the boat. We'll talk about it eventually. You're not going to enjoy yourself. Yeah, there are other issues too on a boat. Yeah. Right. No, you can't, because you're causing them to be Mechalel Shabbat. You yourself are not doing anything. But over there in Iran or in Israel, it's already Shabbat. And they're going to pick up the phone. So they're being Mechalel Shabbat. Makes no difference. You're not allowed to cause another Jew to do a melacha on Shabbat. But if you send the fax, it arrives there on Shabbat by itself, that's okay. You shouldn't pick up. Oh, you don't know. You have to tell them next time, please don't do that because I can't pick up, and allow you to talk. I'm like assisting you to violate the Shabbat. So you have to be very careful with that, sure. You might as well take advantage of that moment and give him musar and teach him a halakha. One more time. Take a pot. Right. One more time. You have hot water in an urn, okay? Where's the soup right now? Where is the pot? It's in the refrigerator, right? So what you're doing is you want that water to become kosher, to become lukewarm, so you can drink it, because it's been very cold from the refrigerator. You can add hot water to cold water, as long as that hot water will only make the cold water a little warm. You cannot cook that cold water again. So if it's going to come to a yat soledetbo point, it's a surah point to everybody. You cannot bring the cold liquid back to the level of being yat soledetbo. That's perfectly okay. It's just like adding any hot liquid to cold liquid. Oh, it's like a baby bottle? That's fine. That's for sure okay. Yeah. If it was cooked once, it's okay. Yeah. What difference does it make? I don't know what difference it... No. Therefore, it's not going to make a difference because there's so much hot water. Yeah. The problem with these rulings is, in theory, it might be okay under certain situations, but very difficult to distinguish.